So how do you know the difference between a friend and an acquaintance? I've always thought about that now and then. I think about the people I have as friends and the people I have as acquaintances. I was talking about love recently in a wedding, and I used Proverbs 17:17. I'm going to turn there in just a minute. But in weddings, I like to talk about people sticking with someone through hard times, because I think that's one of the challenges of being married, is that things don't always go right. I'll probably talk about that more than married couples want to hear, but that's the reality, right? Things don't always go well. If they went well and easily, then there wouldn't be any challenge to it. Anita wouldn't have to put up with anything. And what good would that do her? She's done a good job of sticking with me through a lot of stuff, I think. So marriage is all about that. I know of a politician who left his wife while she was in the hospital. Needless to say, he wasn't reelected. People that took notice of that didn't like that. We know it isn't right to abandon a person in a time of need. Perhaps the question worth asking is, what is a time of need? You look through Scripture and you see a lot of stories about people in trouble, people going through difficulties, and the question arises, what's going to happen next? Who's going to be their friend? Who's going to be their neighbor? So Proverbs 17:17, Solomon writes, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." It's born for adversity. That's his time to step up, is what he's saying. Solomon observed that relationships are put to the test when things aren't going well. Everyone is ready to be a friend when everyone is fun and healthy. Their friend is fun and healthy. Everyone's ready to be a brother when their brother is doing all the right things. It's when we disappoint each other. It's when we say the wrong things. It's when we fail that we need a friend the most. I think that's what that scripture is all about. I think when Solomon made that statement, maybe he was looking back at King David, because you look back at King David's life, and I think there's a particular circumstance in 1 Samuel that we read about. David had a very special relationship with Johnathan, the son of Saul. And it was a relationship that carried David through some very rough times. I think God put Johnathan into David's life so that he could get through those tough times, and so that he could know that God loved him through this friend. We look there in chapter 20 in 1 Samuel. It says, "Then David fled from Naioth and Ramah, and came and said to Johnathan, 'What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father that is seeking my life?'" See, David was out. He'd slain Goliath. He was leading Saul's troops into battle. He was winning for the kingdom. And Saul then takes a spear and tries to skewer him to the wall. It's a really crazy set of circumstances, and yet, if you look at it, you can kind of understand what's going on in Saul's mind, because all the people are cheering on David. They're making David look better than Saul, and Saul's feeling like he's second best. He resents David. He's jealous of David. David has something that Saul doesn't have. And so Johnathan said to him, Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Yet David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, 'Do not let Johnathan know this, or he will be grieved.' But truly as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death." Then Johnathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." So David said to Johnathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and he ought to sit down to eat with the king. But let me go that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, 'David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. And if he says it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself, for why then should you bring me to your father? Johnathan said, Far be it from you, for I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then I would not tell you about it. So I've always thought, this is what Solomon must have been thinking of, because you have this really tough circumstance. I mean, Johnathan, he's looking after his father. He's got to choose sides here in some way as things unfold here. David's running from Saul. He'd thrown a spear at David in an attempt to kill him. Saul had attacked David out of jealousy because people were hailing David's achievements more than Saul's. And Saul was living in fear, I think, that David would replace him. And he thought, if you're my son, if you're my loyal family, you'll do the right thing and you'll stick up for me. You'll choose my side over David's side. And of course, the thing that Johnathan wants to do is be like, I don't want to choose sides here. He's kind of caught in the middle. He wants to be a friend to David, and he wants to be a good son to his dad. And in his mind, there's no controversy between those two things. It was tough being a king, though. I mean, hundreds of years later, you'd see the Roman emperors acting a lot like Saul. They would kill off their enemies, They had somebody plotting against them. If they thought somebody might have a reason to plot against them, their thinking was, better kill them off first before they have a chance to get you. Caligula was like that in particular, right? They're going around hunting people down in his life, trying to kill them off. King Herod, we hear about killing off all of his own sons because they might be next in line, right? So they would have a motive to take Herod's place. Fear can cause people to do crazy, hateful things. And so fear is an emotion we have to keep an eye on. So when David's running from Saul's fear and anger, he turned to his friend Johnathan. David and Johnathan had made a covenant together. Back in chapter 18, you can see them making this agreement with each other. They're going to stick by each other's side no matter what. And you see the effects of it here in chapter 20. It calls upon Johnathan to make a decision. He can choose sides against David, supporting his father, or he can choose sides with David. And there really wasn't an in-between. The situation was a true test of just what that agreement meant to Johnathan. How strong was his love for David? Many relationships come to that point where a decision must be made between being either a true friend or to prove to be an acquaintance. And sometimes it's about choosing to do the right thing, right? I mean, from Jonathan's perspective, he can look at this circumstance and he's denying the fact that his father is going to do something evil like this. And David's trying to open up his eyes. But Johnathan understands there's a right and a wrong here if his father is trying to kill off David. So he needs to choose the right thing. People reach that point in marriages sometimes where they're tempted by an outside party, or people reach that point where they hear rumors about a friend where they have to decide whether to believe in the rumors or believe in the person. People reach that point when their friend falls apart, has a mental breakdown, or sins or fails them in some way, goes bankrupt maybe. And at that point, the friend shows himself to be who he truly is. Johnathan intended to be true to that agreement. He stuck close to David through adversity. He was there helping him out when he figured out that in fact Saul was trying to take David's life. He warned David to stay away. He didn't throw his father away either, but he helped David to protect himself. In Acts chapter 15, we've been studying in Acts a story that I think is really interesting about John Mark and the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul was very serious about his missionary business. Very concerned that the gospel get to people And anything that got in the way, he wanted to take care of that stuff. So verse 36 tells us, yes, Paul's about to head off on his second missionary journey. It says, after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are. And Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and left, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. So being a missionary was a pretty tough business. Paul and his companions, they were in constant danger. Paul talks about how he was beaten with rods, he was imprisoned many times, he was stoned, he was laughed at. Paul went through a lot of difficulties. And so it was no small thing to him when John Mark deserted the mission. They were on a mission to share the gospel with people. It was serious business, and it was hard. I don't think we grasp just how difficult that would be, traveling along and having people throw stones at you, having people threaten you constantly. And so from Paul's perspective, desertion was a pretty big deal. And it was a reason not to take John Mark with them again. Barnabas, on the other hand, he's got the opposite point of view. He's like, we're following Christ here. Christ would forgive him. We should forgive him. And it's not a really clear-cut choice here that Luke lays out. He lays out these two different options. And Paul does choose Silas, and things go well there. And it says they went with the blessing of the church. But Barnabas makes a point, and Luke doesn't say Barnabas is wrong and Paul is right. Maybe we'd like him to kind of clarify that for us in some way. But fear can lead people to run back home. And I think Barnabas realized that. Paul realized that too. But it turns out, in the long run, Paul also understood the relationship and working things out. He didn't throw John Mark away as a person, and I think that was kind of key in the long run. You see in 2 Timothy, perhaps near the end of Paul's life, depending upon whether you believe the passage in 2 Timothy is really about the end of things there for Paul as he's in prison, it seems like. Verse 9 says, make every effort to come to me soon, speaking to Timothy, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in service. But Tychicus I have left in Ephesus, and he goes on there. So here he's talking about all these closing remarks. This is years later, and you have Paul concerned because everybody's kind of deserted him. He's in a time of need from his perspective. He's hanging around in jail. Demas, he says, loved the present world and deserted. Again, you see that word deserted. Paul took, being a friend very seriously. If you're his friend, you're with him through thick and thin, or you're not a friend. And it broke Paul's heart at times. I think it broke his spirit. The thing that helped him to keep on with the message of God was knowing that there were people there with him who loved him and who would stick with him. It's a rather heartwarming story here, though, because, of course, we read Mark had deserted him earlier. And he says, bring Mark with you when you come. And he knew Mark would come. That's part of the interesting thing there, right? Because you would think, well, Mark, he was kind of shunned on that second missionary journey. And you think, well, Mark's going to bear a grudge and they're not going to talk ever again and it's going to be trouble. But obviously they fixed that relationship somewhere along the line because it says he wants Mark to come there and be with them. And he knows Mark will come, and he knows Mark will be a big help to him. So Paul got over that breach in the relationship. I've actually heard some people say, we weren't that good of friends. Time of need sprung up. and you call on a friend and somebody says something like, well, we weren't that good of friends. I thought that was kind of an interesting statement for somebody to say. In other words, I don't need to see you through something like that. That's not my responsibility. That's somebody else's job. Go find a better friend than me, because I'm not that one. I think that one of the questions that comes up in life is, what kind of friend will we be? Do we have an obligation to be a friend even if we don't feel like it? I think it's the point of the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. I'm not going to read that whole story, but in Luke 10 you have this parable that Jesus tells. And he tells it in answer to a question that's asked by a lawyer who stood up. He asks about the law. He says, what does the law mean? What does it say? What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus asks him, what does the law say? And Jesus says, hey, you've answered correctly. And then the lawyer wants to justify himself, and so he asks this question, and who is my neighbor? And his point with that question, verse 29, and who is my neighbor? He has a point with that he wants to say, I want it clearly defined because I want to know who my neighbor is, because I have to love my neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that'll work right nicely. I can live with that statement because then I can just define out the people I don't want to love. I can put them over here, and I can define the people I do want to love, and I can put them over here. And I can just deal with this group, the reliable group, until one of them messes up, and then I'll put them back over here so I can deal with the smaller group, right? That's the way some people work, right? We have this group that we'll work with. I love my neighbor because they're sane. This is the sane group over here. This is the group over here who doesn't make mistakes. Haven't seen them mess up terribly badly, right? They haven't said anything offensive to me lately, so I can love them as I love myself. Maybe we love ourselves that way. I don't know, where we only love ourselves when we're not making mistakes, or when we haven't disappointed ourselves, when we haven't failed at something. Who is my neighbor? And then he tells this story about a man who's traveling along the road, gets beaten by thieves, and he's lying there looking kind of needy. And Jesus' point is 3 guys walk by, none of them know this guy. They don't have an obligation to stop and help this man who's fallen by the side of the road. And not only do they not have an obligation from the perspective of an ordinary person, we look around with I don't have to deal with that. It's not my problem. And it's a little bit dangerous as well, right? Because you don't know, that guy could be faking. There could be thieves still roaming around. I better walk faster through this path, because the same thing could happen to me. Let's move it along so we're not at risk as well. So the question of who is my neighbor is asked, and the answer comes with this long story about 3 people who didn't even know somebody. And yet one of them stopped, took a risk, took an interest, and helped this man who was fallen by the side of the road. And of course, you and I, we're not going to see anyone beaten by the side of the road on our way to Jericho. Not only do we live thousands of miles away, it's possible you'd see somebody beaten by the side of the road. But it's more likely that you'll see somebody who is hurting in some other way, who's going through some sort of circumstance in their lives, who has a family member with cancer. Maybe you don't know them, and you can just see them crying there by the side of the road, in front of the Walmart, wherever. Not my problem. Some people will walk on by. And Jesus' point is pretty clear about who is my neighbor. And I think it really goes back to, you look at Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times. A brother is born for adversity. And it's not about who you're a brother of or who you're a friend of. It's who are you? What kind of person are you going to be toward the people you see around you, to the people close to you particularly, the people who need your help when it matters most?